Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. We are honored to have Rabbi Dr. Marc Shapiro on the podcast. And before we begin, we would like our audience to know a little bit about you. So if you can, please give us just a brief about who you are.
Okay, thank you. A pleasure, honor to be here. I grew up most of my life in New Jersey, had a typical modern Orthodox education in day school and high school, studied in Israel. Then my BA is from Brandeis, my PhD is from Harvard. I was Professor Isidore Yitzhak Tversky's, actually his last PhD student that he saw to completion, the doctorate. Along the way, I also studied some with Rav Soloveitchik in the summer. I got smicha from Ephraim Greenblatt. I worked as a rabbi for a few years. So I've done a number of different things, but my main job is work at the University of Scranton, a professor in the religion department. And in summers, I lead Jewish history tours and try to write and keep my voice out there. I guess that's enough to say, I think, about me.
Yeah, and you have excellent shiurim on the Chabura. I do want to plug some of your books, Changing the Immutable, Limits of Orthodox Theology, among others that we're very, well versed in. And, we also want to recommend the audience listen to your new series on the Reform movement, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. We kind of want to, emphasize this because it's fascinating. It's really, really interesting. And I think a lot of people just dismiss the Reform movement offhand without actually studying the history. So we want to kind of get to know, what it is that you're going to be you are discussing on your series. So first, I want to just discuss the origins of the first generation of the Reform movement. What was Gershom Scholem's thesis on this, and what are your thoughts on his thesis?
Okay, two separate things. First of all, you speak about reform. What Scholem is speaking about is right at the beginning. Like, why did the reform happen, and where did it come from? Did it just come out of the blue? And Scholem, he saw really Sabbatianism in everything, or he tried to uncover it. And he makes the claim that there was a connection, not just between the early reform, but also early Haskalah, and Sabbatianism. His argument basically is that, well, first he tries to actually make some connections, actually physical connections between people, Sabbatians and early Haskalah. But the basic argument is that Sabbatianism, it's antinomianism. That is the idea that Jewish law is not binding. The whole Sabbatian idea, we're entering into a new era, that really set the stage for a questioning of the binding nature of halakha, and really allowed for reform to take root, I guess you could say, in the Jewish community, because ideas about Jewish law, Sabbatian type of ideas, had already filtered in, I guess you could say, the best way to put it. Others have said, Scholem, as far as I know, did not say this, that it's also due, Sabbatianism had an influence in another way, the great disputes, the Emden Eibschitz dispute, that led to such a degeneration in the eyes of the people, of the rabbis, because they're killing each other, attacking each other, and with the lack of respect in the rabbinic class, that opened up the doors to possibilities of new approaches, new rabbis. In terms of Scholem's point, the second point, which Scholem, as far as I know, does not make, it probably has some validity. The first point, I think scholars have basically rejected this. There really doesn't seem to be any evidence about the individual connections. And if I could say from my own perspective, you always have to ask yourself, what if? So what if there never was a Sabbatian movement? Do we really think that the Reform movement wouldn't have developed? That in modern times, all you have to do is look at the other Judaism, you have to look at Christianity, you see they had a Reform movement as well. It's hard to imagine that by the 18th century, when there's an Enlightenment out there in Europe and where Jews are being welcomed to a limited extent to participate in general culture, that there's another option out there. It isn't just Judaism or Christianity. You have this middle ground that you can be Jewish and Christian and meet in the middle ground, the neutral space. that Jews would have remained committed to halakha, even without Sabbatianism. The idea that there wouldn't have arisen a reform movement, I see it as incomprehensible, his position, because certainly there would have arisen a reform movement. Now, why would it have been? Because Jews would have rejected Jewish law. There's no question that with modernity, many Jews would have felt that we don't want to be, bound to these archaic laws. And at the same time, you would have had people who have arisen who said, well, does that mean we're going to lose these Jews entirely? No, we want to offer them another form of Judaism, one that you can still remain Jewish. Because remember, the early reformers were not converting; they were not becoming apostates. They wanted to remain Jewish, and they suffered for remaining Jewish. If they would have become Christian, the whole world would have been open to them. But they remained Jewish. So you see, they had a certain amount of pride in their Judaism, but they didn't want their Judaism to be understood as just through halakha. Now, where did they get these ideas? Well, if you're living in Germany in the 18th century, enlightened opinion is talking about how organized religion doesn't make sense. Ideas of miracles, obligations, and you had the exact same thing going on in the Christian world. So it makes sense that those Jews who wanted to leave the confines of the ghetto, given the opportunity, you didn't have a Tarim Derech Eretz of Shamshon Raphael Hirsch. You had the choice either to be part of greater German society, enlightened society, or living like a ghetto sort of existence. And the idea that you're going to go to university and still follow halacha, that option wasn't available. So I think that we have to conclude that Sholem's argument is questionable. I don't even know if you can make the case that Sabbatianism sped up the movement towards reform. It appears to me, at least from how I see it, that this is something completely independent with no relationship whatsoever. It's really response to what's going on in an enlightened German society or in English society, because there was a reform movement in England also people forget about.
Yeah, people also make the same kind of connection with Maimonideanism, leading to enlightenment or Kabbalah. I've heard many theories, but I'm curious to know what you lightly touched on, the Rabbi Yaakov Emden and Rabbi Jonathan Eibeshitz controversy. How does he make that connection there? He's just saying that they're
I'm saying I don't recall him actually speaking about. He might say it, but many others have made the point. Maybe that's why he felt he didn't need to, that the breakdown, I think Gretz makes the point even, that the breakdown of rabbinic authority because of the dispute. Look, everyone was in Chayrim. The Emden forces were putting them in Chayrim and vice versa. And if you're a layperson and you're looking, and these are our Gedolim, these are our great rabbis, and they're attacking one another like that, it can only lead to a decline of their prestige in people's eyes. And that the argument is made that's what led to the opening for Haskalah, because look, if this is who our rabbis are, we're not going to be people, sophisticated people with sensitivity, they're going to see a problem with this, and they're going to be inclined to move in a different direction if offered. So the claim is made that, and I think there is validity to this, that the rabbis in the 18th century, remember, the Haskalah, the movement away from traditional Judaism, really comes very shortly after these great disputes. And it isn't just Emden Eibeshitz. This tore apart all of German Jewry. The Pnei Yeshua, people don't realize this. Rabbi Shua Falk, the great Pnei Yeshua, was also on Rabbi Yaakov Emden's side. And many other Gedolim were on it. Today, people assume it's just Rabbi Yaakov Emden, but it's not the case at all. And whatever shul you went to, you sort of were involved in this dispute to a certain extent. The big shuls in the cities, I'm saying.
Who are some of the figures that really began the movement? Like who are
the reform movement?
Yes, the first generation. How did it, like,
okay.
who were the first people to...
When I speak about the reform, I'm not speaking now about, let's say, students of Mendelssohn who just gave up traditional Judaism and either adopted some sort of universal religion or no religion. Now, I'm talking about people who actually advocated a new type of Judaism. And you had community of David Friedlander. You had community in Berlin and Hamburg, basically groups of Jews, and they found certain rabbis who were willing to lead them. So, for instance, there was a man named Eliezer Lieberman. We don't know that much. Before I even go on, your readers, full treatments of this can be found in this book by Michael Meyer. What I tried, it's called Response to Modernity, or a History of the Reform Movement in Judaism. What I tried to do in the series is do some things which haven't really had much discussion, namely the rabbinic role. Traditional rabbis, their involvement of it, like he speaks about in Westphalia. You had things going on. You had in Berlin, in Hamburg. There was a movement of lay people first. This starts from the lay people that they want a different type of synagogue service. No one is saying to get rid of the Sabbath. How much these people observe the Sabbath? It's hard to imagine that there were any real Sabbath observers the way we think of it, but they wanted to go to the synagogue. And some of the things they wanted were, you'd be surprised, of reform. They wanted sermons in the vernacular, sort of like we get every week in our synagogues. Everything was in Yiddish. They wanted it, however, in German. They wanted music. Something that our synagogues all have. It's music, singing of the sort we have, by the way, is not a traditional Jewish thing either. But they're not even referring to that. They're referring to music like of a cantor and a choir and an even musical instrument, the organ. The organ was considered very important. Of course, can you play an organ on Shabbos? We'll get into that as well. So they wanted decorum, they wanted aesthetics. They think of the shtibel. If you know what a shtibel is, they wanted a different. And even if it's not a shtibel, they had big synagogues in Germany, but you didn't have decorum. You didn't have. We have descriptions, by the way, of non-Jews who came to the synagogue. And look, when you feel comfortable in a synagogue, maybe you don't treat it the way you're supposed to have it. They wanted to get rid of piyutim. Look in our synagogue. I can speak for the Ashkenazim. My synagogue doesn't have any of the piyutim. What happened to them all? They got rid of them. So I guess we're reform also. One of the ironies is that a number of the reforms.
He's been advocating.
A number of the reforms are now considered basic today in the modern Orthodox or even in some Haredi communities. Some of them wanted to change the pronunciation of to the Sephardic pronunciation, a variety of things like this. And there was an individual, don't know much about him. His name was Eliezer Lieberman. He was not he was a learned person. How learned, it's hard to know, but he was learned enough to write a halakhic work. He had a good Hebrew ability. And he was asked by the earlier reformers, can this be justified halachically? Because they wanted to be, at least, they wanted the synagogue to be halachic. And that's what's unique about the first generation of Reform. They saw themselves as a halachic movement. By the second, third generation, they had no interest in halacha. But the first generation, they wanted to be halachic. So Eliezer Lieberman begins sending, he wrote his book as well, Or No Gods called, which set forth his position. But then he got rabbis from Europe, mostly from Italy, one from Hungary, a couple of Meshulachim from Israel, to answer questions of his about these reforms. Now, we don't know how many rabbis he asked. Presumably, he asked lots of rabbis, and they turned him down. But he was able to publish a book called Noga HaTzedek, which has mainstream rabbis, even Rabbi Aaron Horan, who would later be a leading Reform rabbi. Hakham José Faur referred to him as Acher. But at this time, he still was a traditional rabbi with reformist ideas, and he published a volume in which they defended. So, for instance, an organ in a synagogue. That found a defense in this volume. What's wrong with an organ in a synagogue if a non-Jew plays it? As Rav Moshe Kunitz, who was the Dayan in Pest, today we call it Budapest, wrote, every single Shabbat, the non-Jew comes in and turns off the candles in the synagogue. And if it's, if the candles were to go out, the non-Jew would come in and light them. Well, if that's allowed, then why can't an organ be allowed, played by a non-Jew? And that will bring people to the synagogue so they can appreciate it. And after all, he said, and others pointed out, they used to have weddings Friday afternoon, which would continue into Shabbat, and non-Jews would play music. Today, it's hard to imagine it, but non-Jews would play music at wedding meals on Shabbat because it's a Sudas mitzvah. And the non-Jew is playing it, and he's told before Shabbat to do it. It's permissible. So that was the argument that was made, and prayer in the vernacular. The people wanted to have prayer in German. Now, what could be wrong with prayer in German? All these authors wrote in this volume. After all, doesn't the Mishnah, doesn't the Rambam tell us explicitly prayer can be in any language? So these were the sorts of matters they wanted to change, to update. Nothing about moving the Sabbath to Sunday. Nothing about, that kosher food is only for an earlier time when they didn't know how to keep the food, at good temperatures. Nothing about the fact that a lot of these laws are only to keep us away from pagans. And today we live among dignified Christians and therefore they're not applicable. No, it was a halakhic movement designed to modernize Judaism. I can't hear you.
Oh, so I wanted to ask you, how was the response of the Orthodox rabbis at this time towards this new kind of kula seeking kulot system of Eliezer Lieberman? So, like, what was like the climate within the Orthodox circle towards what was going on over there?
Okay. Well, the first thing to note is that we don't want to call them Orthodox yet. They only become Orthodox sort of when there's a reform. They're the traditionalist rabbis, and the response was furious because the rabbis understood that much of this was about imitating the Christian practices. Much of what they wanted to do was an imitation. Why do you want an organ? Because the Christians have it, and look, you have to. The Rav Soloveitchik once said that maybe if Rav Moshe Sofer, the Hakham Sofer, was not so strident in his opposition, that we could have stopped the reform movement. After all, what did they want? Many of the things they were not so extreme. We could have compromised. But then Rabbi Soloveitchik said, "But you know what? If he wasn't so strident, things would have become much worse." The rabbis, the leaders, the Gedolei Yisrael, we call them, understood that that for the reform communities, these new communities that they would then call them reform, this was only the first step. And that this wasn't all that they wanted, that this was basically going to open the floodgates. And their assumption was, and I think it's correct, that the rabbis who replied, rabbis in Italy, one in Budapest, they didn't understand what was going on. They were answering this question just like it's a pure halakhic question without knowing the context of what's going on in Germany, and that you have communities of irreligious people, and this is just like the opening step before they move in, which they did move further along. And I think it's from Mordechai Bennett, if I remember correctly, he says, look at these letters. Look at the letters in Nogat Tzedek. You don't have any local rabbis. Why did Lieberman write to the people in the other countries? Precisely because they didn't know the situation. And they would answer it just as a pure halacha question. If you were living in Germany and you saw up close what was going on, you would have understood that this was just, you had to close the doors. This isn't just a pure halachic question. This would open the floodgates to more and more. And I think we have to say that the rabbis, listen, a rabbinic expression, chacham adif min navi, that a wise person is more insight, you could say, than a prophet. They, Rav Moshe Sofer, Rav Mordechai Bennett, and the others understood what was going on here, and they put a stop to it to a large extent. But it is ironic that so many of these reforms, if you read them today, we actually have them in our communities. But that's because we sort of fell into them organically, and that it's very different. Rav Moshe Sofer understood very clearly that the kavanah, the intention, really determines many of these matters. In fact, he coined the phrase, what's new is forbidden from the Torah, because today you can't have novelty, because it's so dangerous, because you have a whole group trying to tear down traditional Judaism. In earlier generations, or in the Sephardic world, for instance, this isn't a problem, because there isn't a reform movement, so perhaps you could be more liberal. Incidentally, if you go to Budapest today, the Dohani synagogue, that's the big synagogue there of the liberal Jews. They call them the Neolog. To this day, on Shabbat, they have an organ played by a non-Jew. And that's in line with the psak of Ramosha Kunitz, the Dayan of Pest.
Wow. Something that I'm taking from what you said is that the beginning of the first generation reform, essentially what you explained, came from actually from the bottom up. It was from the people, right? The people wanted certain changes, and that
Correct.
sprung into what it became, for better or for worse, right? But what I'm taking from that is that, you know, in general, we tend to think that change can only come from leaders, but in reality, what we can learn from that is that, you know, we as members of the community, members of the Jewish people, as people, can create change if we do it the right way. It's possible to make change. We're not
absolutely
toward leadership.
In fact, by the second and third generation reform, the rabbis were running the show when they were leading it. But in the early years, it was the people. They didn't have rabbis. They started their synagogues. Later, they called them temples. And they were not happy with the main synagogue, and they wanted to make changes. But of course, what you say is absolutely correct. And change can come from the people. It's always come from the people. Sometimes consciously, but often unconsciously. That is, the people just develop in a certain way. And the early reform movement, but what I'm speaking about is a one generation thing, because when the rabbis didn't go along with it, and it became obvious that you couldn't create halakhic reform synagogues, if you want to use the term reform, then by the next generation, halakha is really jettisoned as a binding principle. Leaders like Geiger and others, whole time they have no interest in halakha. They come out of strict Orthodox backgrounds, but they believe that we're now in a new era, and we don't need to go to the rabbis to get their opinions.
Okay, so on that note, since we're now segueing into the second generation reform, when and why did the second generation reform develop? You touched upon it a little bit now, but if maybe you could expand on that a little bit, right? And how did it differ from the first?
Okay, well, No God Tzedek appears in 1818. Geiger's dates are 1810 to 1874. So by 1840, let's say 50, you have a real strong reform movement of some significance. What you have is you have a group of individuals, like-minded individuals, who have been raised traditionally, and some were real Talmidei Chachamim. Whole time, Geiger's a big Talmid Chacham. He was a chavrusa at the University of University of Bonn with Hirsch, and they together come to the conclusion that Judaism needs to be updated. And you have some in this group who are radical, extremely radical, who want to jettison the entire oral law. Basically, they're very much like Karaites, that they just the Bible, that's all they want. Then there's others who are much more traditional, who see reform. They take the mantle of Pharisees, that we reformers are like the old Pharisees. We're the traditionalists, and you can't ask what the Pharisees said. You have to ask what they would say if they were around today. And that's Geiger's position. And you have many rabbis in towns, and you have to understand, you're in a small town, let's say in Germany, and the people, they just listen to what the rabbi says. And if the rabbi comes home one day and says that now the rabbis have decided you only need to keep 1 day of the Yom Tov, not 2 days anymore. What do the people know? They'll go along with it. That's why it was a very dangerous situation. And it took a while before it became clear that there were two camps here, the Orthodox camp and the Reform camp, because there was a lot, as I would say, false advertising. They have rabbis in little towns, they can advertise their positions. But Geiger was a well-known figure, and he really is the most important. And the argument basically is that we are now at a different stage. By the let's say, 19th century, the argument is we're at a different stage. We're living among civilized Gentiles. Many of the laws in the past were designed to keep us separate from the non-Jews. These are not the type of non-Jews today. That we no longer can believe what other people believe. That is, we can't believe in Torah Sinai tradition in the traditional sense. So if you have the argument that we can't believe in Torah the way it used to be believed in, so what's important? So monotheism is important, ethical monotheism, the idea that the Jews have a mission, that we're holy people because we spread morality. So that becomes the stress, as Geiger himself, as I recall, said. We're not inspired by the rule of an etrog anymore. We're not jettisoning all of the Bible, but we're looking for what speaks to us. Not everything speaks to us. So it was a recreating of Judaism in line with modern sensibilities. So from an Orthodox perspective, this is terrible. This is the worst. They're destroying Torah, so you can understand why they attack them so brutally and viciously and justifiably from a halakhic perspective. But if you take the broader view, you can actually be what we'd say malamed zchut. Remember, these are people who, although the Orthodox said to them, you're no different than the Christians, you want to get rid of Torah, you're like Paul, the Saul of Tarsus. You're saying that, we don't need the law anymore. But these are people who could have abandoned Judaism. And they still suffered as Jews. There was all sorts of disabilities on them in professions and other areas, and yet they chose not to. They chose to remain Jewish. So they were proud to be Jewish. So from our perspective, I think we have to look at them and say, although, of course, they were wrong in their views of halakha, but to see them as the Orthodox of the time saw them, as simply wanting the easy way out and not caring about Judaism, really, depends how you look at the glass, half full, half empty. They suffered for their Judaism. It's not a Judaism that we recognize, but in their mind, it was Judaism. And look, at the end of the day, many of these Jews died al Kiddush Hashem because they remained Jewish. Had they converted to Christianity in the mid-19th century, 100 years later, they would have been regarded as Aryan because it would have been 4 or 5 generations. So we have to give some. Well, Rav Kook says that even in every negative thing, there's sparks of holiness. So what's the spark of holiness in Reform? I think this is a spark of holiness, that they still showed a connection. They didn't want to give up that last spark of Judaism that they had. That something was keeping them in the community. It wasn't Torah the way we see it, but it was something. Yeah.
So they essentially wanted to kind of focus on Judaism as an idea versus law, right? Essentially.
Yes, the law, there's no such thing as law anymore. There's only suggestions, I guess you could say.
Right.
If a practice gives you inspiration, then do it. So what's Shabbos? Shabbos to them is not the 39 malachot. It's not what you can't do. It's the idea of Sabbath, the spirit, the day of a family time, of connecting to God. So some people said, well, then why don't we make it on Sunday? Then you could do the same thing. But that was voted down. They had 3 major rabbinic reform conferences where they voted on these matters. Circumcision. Some reform rabbis said it's barbaric, and others said, no, it ties us to the 3,000 years of Jewish history. And so it's not a command. The practices are never a command anymore from God. Rather, it's our way of connecting to God because they believed in God. But these are creations of humans to try to connect to God. And we have to decide whether or not we still find meaning in them.
You know what's interesting to me? We can make the same sort of criticism on the opposite direction towards orthodoxy, in that orthodoxy is so hyper obsessed with halakha that they lose the forest from the trees from meaning they lose the soul of the matter, right? Because that
obviously,
right.
That point has been made by many. It was made very strongly by Rav Kook.
Yes.
But Heschel said that Orthodox Jews are not in awe of God; they're in awe of the Shulchan Aruch.
Right.
I mean, that's a big problem when you could be at a Pesach Seder, and instead of focusing on this great redemption, the focus is on the shiurim, the kazayis, this and that. I mean, when I was in yeshiva, I'll never forget this. They took us, I think it was Erev Shabbos or Shabbos, I can't remember, to the Western Wall, and you could see Haredi. The halacha is you're supposed to do kriya when you see that, and for whatever reason today people don't do it. There's discussions as to why they don't. That's bottom up, by the way. The people don't do it, then the rabbis try to justify it. But the sources say you should. So we went on either Erev Shabbos, I forget, or right before Shabbos or Shabbos. But I remember that we were told we're going so we wouldn't have to do the Kriya. And even then, I was only 18. I remember thinking, this is like so wrong, so orthodox, if you want to put it. We're supposed to see Harabayit and be so, moved by the scene of the non-Jewish house, houses of worship, the shrine up there, that we're supposed to do Kriya But instead, we try to find a trick to go at a time where we don't have to do it to spare our shirts. I mean, that would be an example of seeing losing the forest for the trees instead of, and unfortunately, Orthodox Jews fall into that trap, what Heschel called halachocentrism. That, look, Rav Soloveitchik said that halacha is not the ceiling, it's the floor. We have to follow halacha, of course, but that's not all there is. That's the basis. And then you have, if you can be what the Ramban says in Naval Bereshut Torah, you can follow all the halachot exactly, and yet you're still a scoundrel because you lose sight that halacha, there's a telos, it's trying to get you somewhere. So there's no question that the non-Orthodox, the Reform, had a point. And there were many problems in the traditional world. Hirsch himself pointed out there were many problems. Hirsch was a reformer with a small r. But he adopted the critique. He agreed with much of the critique of the reformers. What sense does it make to say you're not going to have sermons in the vernacular? What, Yiddish is holy language or something now? Torah was given in Yiddish. The people want music, so you have a choir. Hirsch has a choir. Hirsch started wearing gowns. What's the problem? I mean, the other rabbi said it's absolutely forbidden. But the people, they wanted it. They thought it was dignified. And if that's going to bring them to the synagogue, Hirsch thought that you're cutting off your nose to spite your face, that you're making stands on meaningless small things. You have to look for the bigger picture here. So German neo-orthodoxy, German orthodoxy, which gets going through Hirsch, Hildesheimer, and others, they recognize the problems that the Reform pointed to, but they offered a different solution, obviously. It's not abandoning halacha, but it's creating a new type of Judaism. Geiger was very upset with Hirsch when Hirsch published his 19 letters, because Geiger thought that he was going to be dealing just with old-fashioned Judaism, which would remain a tiny segment. But here Hirsch comes along and says, no, you can be observant and you can have everything. You can go to the university and be a government worker. Geiger's whole point was that traditional Judaism is a pre-19th century form of Judaism. If you want to be a 19th century German Jew, you can only be a Reformed Jew. And the traditionalists agreed with Geiger. They also agreed with Geiger that you're right, you can't go to the university if you want to be a traditional Jew. So what would that have left traditional Judaism with? A small little group. That's it. It's Hirsch who comes on the scene and says, those rabbis, the traditionalists, they're wrong. That we can be part of this German society, but we don't have to give up Torah. So you have to accept parts of the critique of the reformers, because the traditionalist rabbis were living in the 19th century just like they were living in the 18th and 17th and 16th century, and that led to disaster. In the year 1800, every large community was dominated by the traditional Jews. In 2 generations, every city was dominated by the Reform Jews. This happened on the watch of the traditional rabbis. If they were football coaches, they all would have been fired. It happened on their watch. And Hirsch understood this. They allowed Reform to grow. And Hirsch said, you know why they allowed Reform to grow? Because they didn't understand Torah and Derech Eretz. Torah has to deal with every civilization and every era. And the response of Torah is going to be different. These rabbis, they were in 19th century Berlin, and they were acting like they were in 17th century Vilna. You can't have a Judaism like that. So yes, was Hirsch a reformer? Of course, reformer with a small r, but he understood something that the reformers also understood, that Judaism can't remain static.
Isn't a lot of what you're expressing now kind of what modern Orthodoxy is striving for? Exactly.
You have it's not just modern Orthodoxy. Haredim also are doing it, and not the Haredim in Israel, Haredim in America. They're so acculturated. You go to the basketball game and there's a Glatt kosher hot dog stand there. So what? You could fight, you could scream, you could say this is terrible. My kids, Super Bowl Sunday. So what do they do during the half? When I was young in yeshiva, the rabbis would get up and tell you not to watch it. It's terrible. Today they don't say that. They say during the halftime show, call in. They have like a little shiur for 20 minutes. So that's what Torah and Derech Eretz is. You recognize the reality. You're going to fight against things. You can't fight against it. This is the way of the world. So you have to deal with it. And that was what Hirsch understood. He's not saying that in Poland they should wear a gown or that you should have a sermon. Remember, sermons come from the Reform also. We never had sermons. We had drushas. But a sermon, the way we think of it, like a 10-minute talk, which is supposed to edify and give you inspiration, that comes from the Christians, the Protestants. And then the reformers adopted. The people wanted it. It's hard to imagine that people wanted sermons. Today they don't like sermons, but they demanded sermons. They never had that. So it's a good idea. So, but Hirsch isn't saying that you should do this in Poland. You know that when Rav Israel Hildesheimer came to Berlin, he observed that, when Rishon Salanter came to Berlin, he saw Rishon Salanter teaching a class in halakha to young women in Berlin. And he said if a rabbi in Russia ever tried to teach women, advanced halakha, or I shouldn't say advanced, just halakha, they'd throw him out, and for good reason. He said, but I wish that my share in Olam Haba will be Israel Hildesheimer, because every community is different. And you mentioned modern orthodoxy, Hirsch, Hildesheimer, this is a form of modern orthodoxy. It's a recognition of the issues, of the problems, but giving a different solution. Look, girls are being educated. So what are you going to do? You have to have a reform. You have to teach girls then. If they're getting educated secularly, you have to educate them Torah as well. So the reform movement had a correct diagnosis of many of the problems, but there's a solution was the incorrect approach.
They went wayward. The solution went wayward.
Because they assumed that by definition, since they confused, I would say, the shell with the kernel. Yes, there's a shell. The way that Jews, they said you couldn't get, you had to work, let's say, as a merchant. You couldn't have what we would call today white-collar professions, because that would mean you have to go to the university. We can't go to the university. They said you can't make any changes in the synagogue. You can't have the sermons in the vernacular. You can't have sermons at all. You can't have music where people, all the things. And again, it wasn't singing along, but listening to a cantor, all these things, because we can't have any changes. And then the Reform pointed this out, but then they threw out, not only did they make these changes, they threw out halakha. They threw out divine nature of Torah, when really all you had to do was modify the external. And that's what Hirsch's whole point was. He said you need to distinguish between the kernel, the Torah, which is eternal, and the outer form, which is different. Obviously, it's different in every society. That's what Torah and Derech Eretz means. Torah with whatever Derech Eretz there is. And so Reform took the Derech Eretz and they created their own Torah, whereas Hirsch kept the Torah. And since the Derech Eretz has changed, the outer form of it changed. I guess if you want to speak like an Aristotelian, you have matter and form. The matter remains the same, the form changes. But for the reformers, not only the form changed, but the matter was changed. There wasn't any basis of Torah anymore.
Very, very excellent points. There's a lot there to unpack. One of the things that I think is a tragedy, it's the reaction to the reform movement. For example, them championing, like you mentioned, Tanakh, just like the Karaites. It kind of led to a response by the Orthodox or the traditionalists later to just champion Talmud study and halakha, like you said. And till this day, I feel like this is really one part that's just lacking in the Orthodox world.
Majorly.
Well, the Ashkenazic Orthodox world, not the Sephardic Orthodox world. It actually wasn't a response to the reformers. That's a response to the Haskalah, the Maskilim, that begin in Germany. And of course, in Germany, the Maskilim and the reformers, they intersect. But in Eastern Europe, you don't really have reformers. And the reformers you have are really halakhic, completely halakhic. You don't have, they just, you're probably not correct to call them reformers. They're liberals, say. But because the Maskilim, they also wanted a broad, they had a good diagnosis also. The diagnosis was that we have to, have some breadth. Not everyone can function, either go to yeshiva or something. They wanted to, Judaism is broader. The Sephardic world never would have had this problem because the Sephardic world recognized you have the great poets in Spain, you have the philosophers, all these things. But Ashkenazi Judaism has always been Talmudic centric. And then when but there never was a problem reading Tanakh, but that wasn't something most people did if you're a Talmud Chacham. But then when the Maskilim started championing this, then you start having a trend against it. You're not even, Shlomo Kluger, great Hakham authority from Gutsia, says you can't even teach kids Tanakh. And the old joke, which isn't just a joke, how do you know a verse from Tanakh? You know it from the Talmud, the page it's on. But this trend actually goes back even to medieval times. The Tosfot already talks about how we don't need to study Tanakh because everything, we got everything in the Talmud, and Hirsch criticizes this in his 19 letters. That's a mistake, but it reached extreme proportions. Because the early opinions were never saying that there's a problem with Tanakh. They're just saying you don't need to. By the time you get to the 19th century, if you're in a Beit Midrash and you're sitting there reading, let's say, Sefer Yecheskel or Sefer Daniel, Chas v'Shalom, they're going to assume that you're not a traditional Jew, that you're some maskil, because that's not what we do. And that's a complete distortion, obviously. And it's, often backlashes lead to extreme positions, and eventually you find your way to the middle ground. But it hurt traditional Judaism a good deal, and it did not allow traditional Judaism to respond, I think, creatively to challenges in the 20th century with the rise of the State of Israel and a return to biblical, sites that and how to relate to this. And fortunately, in the religious Zionist world, there now is a renewed emphasis on Tanakh, Machon Herzog, and much going on. Great stuff. But you're absolutely correct that the response led to you had that response to the reformers. I don't know if you know this, that in Hungary, the response to the reformers was so extreme that they made all sorts of resolutions. So, for instance, you couldn't have a wedding in a synagogue. In Hungary, this was banned because the reformers did it. You could not have a choir. You could not have sermons in the vernacular. This is it's a common theme, and it's an understandable. Things that would be permissible when they're advocated by the other side, then they became very, very problematic. And it takes a while to reach equilibrium.
Fascinating. So we touched on the different sects that splintered off. Besides, Orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, we have many subgroups that have splintered off these primary sects. Sticking to the main branches of Jewish sectarianism today, what would you personally suggest and hope should be done with these issues that we have today?
Well, it's hard to know who's a sectarian or not, because people to the right often see the people to the left as a sectarian. And even just in the wider Orthodox world, you probably are aware of how many leading Orthodox figures have pointed to Yeshivas Chovevei Torah as open Orthodox, as sort of like a sectarian type of reformist movement. So my attitude is that, look, we have to recognize reality here, that we have all these different types of Judaism. You mentioned them. You didn't mention renewal. That's another one. Now, these are all people who, in our era of secularism, of post-religion in much of the world, you have people who want to be Jewish. And that's already a glass half full. And so what do you do with these people? Do you throw them out? Do you reject them? You don't want them? Obviously, there's real difficulties that the Orthodox side has with the others. There's even an aspect which you didn't mention, that when you deal with the Reform movement, for instance, conservative movement to a lesser extent, but also significant, many of the members are not even halakhically Jewish. So that raises its own problems because of patrilineal descent or conversions that we don't recognize. But leaving that aside, I have thoughts about what to do with that as well, but leaving that aside, at the end of the day, we can go back to something that Netziv said, Naftali Yehuda Berlin. He said that among each other, we fight. Obviously, we fight about matters because they're important to us. So if they're not, you don't fight about things if they're not important to you. If we all got along and no one had any disputes, it would mean that we don't take it seriously. However, when it comes to the outside world, the Netziv said this, and he was referring to all types of Jews, just like we have today. You join together, because you need to distinguish. Soloveitchik also elaborates on this. This is what we call klape chutz upanim, that we all still are people. The reformers, the completely irreligious. We see this right now in Israel. When we deal with the enemies, we're all one people. So I think, and I think we're in an era where everyone can recognize that the era of polemics, of criticizing the other, of trying to tear them down, it's past. It doesn't accomplish anything. What's the point of a polemic against the reformers? You're not going to convince anyone. Right. This was all done 100 years ago. Well, I think we need to recognize and treat everyone with respect. They have a different opinion. We think it's incorrect, but they think that we're incorrect. And That way we can coexist, and we want to coexist. We don't want to live like Satmar or living in some shtetl. We want to be part of the larger Jewish people, because even before you had the Reform movement, we still had prayers saying, Rosh Hashanah, Isi Ashkenazim, or Yom Kippur, that we're going to pray with the sinners. We've always had sinners. So we have more sinners today. Most of the Jewish community is sinners, but we're sinners also. We're just sinners in different ways. We're all sinners. Maybe we're better in certain areas, but some of these Reformed Jews, I don't call them non-religious. Some of them are very religious. They're not halakhic, so they're misguided. But we're all one people. And look, in the Sephardic world that you come from, you never had the Reform move. You never had movements, denominations, but you always had different levels of religiosity. And you always were able to be a large tent. The Ashkenazim, unfortunately, have denominations. It's our curse.
That has a lot to do with just living in Christian countries, the influence of that. There's countless sects of Christianity, and I think that you just naturally model after that,
Well, also, I think they were living in eras where secular society was very sophisticated.
Right.
And the people went to universities. That opened up all sorts of possibilities. But at the end of the day, you ask what to do with all these different sects. I say, don't do anything with them. We battle in the square of public ideas, and I think we have a good product. And I think, unfortunately, many of these groups are disappearing, and it's not a good thing. I don't think we should be happy about it, through intermarriage, through assimilation, lack of caring. But as long as we have other types of Jews, I think we should treasure them for what we are. We're a people.
Yeah, I agree. And as Sephardi Jews, we always grew up with that. You have the guy next to you who drives to shul on Shabbat, and the other guy next to you wears a black hat, who's a chassid even. And you don't really see, other than Chabad, you don't really see any groups interacting with the other. I think that what I actually want to advocate for, and what we're trying to do on the podcast as well, is to humanize these other groups. Like, they are part of our, like you mentioned, they're part of our nation. And now post-war, post-October 7th Judaism, we kind of have to, wake up a little bit and kind of change our attitude. It doesn't mean we have to, like you said, accept their beliefs, but it's very rare to find, a modern Orthodox rabbi invited to speak in a Haredi shul, but you'll have a modern Orthodox shul bring a Haredi rabbi to speak in. And I actually would like to see a conversation. Like, I don't know if you know Rabbi Marc B, one of the best Jewish interviewers. I think he's Reform even, and he would interview everyone from Rabbi Mark Angel to Rabbi Sacks to Meir Kahana. I mean, the who's who, and from completely different areas. And I think that was very nice to see, because not often I get to hear a conversation between a Reform rabbi and an Orthodox rabbi. They're not going to persuade us in one way or another, but having a conversation could only benefit the society as a whole. I think that's what.
Now, you said a lot of important things. I'll just add one thing as well. You didn't mention, but you talk about Sephardic communities. Look at the Ashkenazic world. You know how many chayrim against this and that, other than Spinoza. And maybe in Syria you had a chayrim in Aleppo against there's a period, but other than that, you don't have that in the Sephardic world. The issue with the Haredim is a difficult one, because at the end of the day, although it would be very nice for them to invite the modern Orthodox rabbis, they fundamentally don't accept the legitimacy of the modern Orthodox approach. And their whole lifestyle and way of thinking is not like the modern Orthodox. The modern Orthodox, I did classes on the Satmar Rebbe. We want to understand everyone. Doesn't mean we agree with them, but they don't believe in a public setting of giving legitimacy to people who religious leaders who don't share their hashkafa. So I don't really know how you break that down. The idea of a debate, we would love to have a debate. You get people together, but they don't believe in that. It's just a different philosophy, and I don't know how you can change that. So you're never going to get. Yeah. It's a common theme. Every year when I was growing up, the Lakewood Yeshiva would come to my town. There'd be a breakfast for them and raise money for some school in Lakewood. But they would never do the same in Lakewood for one of our schools. That's just the way it is. And you have to. So if you don't want to give any money to one of these institutions in Lakewood, saying because there's no reciprocity, okay, that's one approach. Or you can sort of, I guess, be a bigger person and say that you can recognize that other institutions, even to the right of you, still have value, even while acknowledging that they will not see the same about your institutions, at least not the same to raise money. They might think that they have value to prevent, us from assimilating, that sort of thing. That's just the reality. And I guess that's the definition of being a liberal. In this sense, I think we should all be liberal, that we can have tolerance for those who are not as tolerant to us. That's at least the path I've chosen to lead my life.
And I think modern Orthodox is probably the path that allows for that in a way, because we do, for example, respect the Haredi leadership, and the Beit Din and so on.
Sure. Shivim Panim Torah. Modern Orthodoxy believes there's different paths. The Haredi world, the big problem is that they've forgotten that. And although there's different paths in the Haredi world, but it seems that each Haredi seems to have that this is the Das Torah. That's a problem. Look, there's much we could criticize about the Haredi world, but we also have to acknowledge all the positives, just like there's much you can criticize about the modern Orthodox world. There's some stuff in the Haredi world which is outstanding, absolutely outstanding, which the modern Orthodox world doesn't even get close to that. On the other hand, there's much that we can criticize in the Haredi world. So no side is perfect, and Haredi rabbis recognize this, and privately they will talk about this to you. They talk about it to me all the time. It's hard in a public setting for them to do that, and so you have to accept that. That's just their approach. They have a different approach,
like we were talking about in the beginning.
I was just thinking
the
that
people are they call the shots. Usually how it works. Actually, we did a podcast with, this is reminding me of that interview we did with Reb Alex Gutman.
Yeah.
And we were discussing, the voodoo, we called it Voodoo Judaism, but a lot of stuff that just starts to kind of appear within Orthodox circles, which is like Schlissel Challah and all these strange practices. But
yeah,
the rabbis really, they kind of have to like accept these things, because they just creep in and then everyone starts doing it, and then it becomes very popular, and it's just hard to stop it. And the conclusion of that conversation was that it's not going to come from the rabbis. These things have to be stopped.
Well, what you're saying, it seems to be what's going on in Israel now. There seems to be, look, every time you have a war, like a big event like this, we don't know how society changes afterwards. And you have now thousands of Haredim, and I'm told these are not like the losers, the ones hanging out in Ben Yehuda, the Shababnikim, that these are real yeshiva students who have entered the army. You're having lots of people in the army and Haredi society looking around and seeing that, our mothers are going to sleep, but fine. Our life continues as normal, and yet funerals are going on every day. Someone I know, his son-in-law was killed just today, and I watched the funeral. It could touch to the core Haredi society, and there are rabbis, there are young people, Rabbi Shapiro and others. If you haven't interviewed him, he's certainly a good interview. A leading Haredi thinker there from the younger generation, arguing that we need to make a change. Ooh. So if the people make, and by the way, this is a problem in Haredi society, because the leadership, the leadership in Haredi society. You hear me?
Yeah. What was his name? You said
the name of that.
No, Shua Pfeffer, Pfeffer. He has a magazine, and they call him Haredi Light, but I mean this seems to be the direction that much of the Haredi community, certainly American-style Haredim as well, live in Israel. But you know that something's a brew. How do you know that? Because we've had all sorts of extreme, crazy statements by Haredi Rosh Yeshiva and leaders in the last few weeks. How yeshiva students should not have anything to do with the army. You shouldn't go to funerals. You shouldn't even visit injured soldiers. Extreme, crazy stuff. They see that the ground is shifting, and they're trying to keep the ghetto walls up there and so that's a sign that things are changing. And what's going to happen is that the people on the ground will change it. You're never going to have a complete change. There'll be different communities, but you're going to have, I think, the development of a different style Haredi. We'll call them Haredi who will work, or Haredi Sionim, whatever you want to call them, people who want to be part of a wider society, and the rabbis will emerge, because the communities will appoint the rabbis. And we've seen this again and again. We've seen this with the Hasidic movement. We've seen this with the religious Zionist movement. You think religious Zionists had, they had to find rabbis also for many of their communities. We've seen it we've seen it again and again. And this is just one development.
The anti-Zionism of a lot of those communities is also going to, obviously.
The communities are not anti-Zionist. The people forget what the rabbis say. The rabbis speak a language sometimes, those are the people. The typical Haredi in Israel feels connected to the state of Israel. It's his country. It's he connects to it. And so they
Not so much
practically
here,
they
though. I
already
wouldn't say.
are. Zionism, what does Zionism mean? Zionism is ideology to create a state. The state's already there. So what do you mean Zionism? Everyone who lives there is connected to the state. The issue isn't Zionism. Yes, the Haredim have problems with symbols of the state, Hatikva, things like that. But practically, they live, many of them, as with the exception of going to the army, which is the big one. They live as part. They feel connected to the state of Israel. Look, they know that what anti-Zionism. You get someone in America, some politician, a Talib or something, an anti-Zionist. They know it's anti-Semitism. So there's going to be changes, reforms with a small r. Remember the reforms of Hirsch, the reforms we talk about. You have to distinguish between reforms with a small r and reforms with a large r. We've always had reforms of Judaism.
We kind of have this discussion.
We've had this debate.
Yeah, because I also have relatives in Israel, some who are not religious, who used to be Haredi, let's say, and went off the derech or whatever it is. And they're like saying the opposite. No, it's not. Nothing's changing. We spoke to a few days ago. We spoke to Rabbi Slifkin, and he was saying the changes are it's so minute and it's so small. He was kind of downplaying it. I kind of believe that myself, but I'm hoping that he's wrong.
I'm the positive. I'm the positivist.
Yeah.
Listen, I don't know. I don't live there. I can just tell you what I'm reading, what I'm hearing. They're saying that. And we don't know. None of us knows. Is everything going to go back to normal like it was before October 7th? It's hard to imagine that. Jews are being buried every single day. And the Haredi world has to look at this. There has to be a cheshbon nefesh, as we say, a reckoning of how, again, it's not just the army. If you live in a Haredi settlement, and there are in the West Bank, you have some settlements, you don't do your own guard duty. I had a person on one of my tours in the summer was complaining that Pesach night his son couldn't be at Seder because he was at one of these Haredi places. He was guarding them. Why can't they guard themselves? This idea that they can't carry a gun, that they're not. Well, where do they get this thing from? I think they're going to have to step up, especially with the population, and. I don't know if it necessarily means in the army for most of them, but national service. There has to be something. There has to be some involvement more. And I think most of them are going to recognize this, or many of them are. Look, we could be wrong. It could go back to the way it was before. But
I don't think it's going to go back. What I think is very, very interesting, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but this is just the general feeling I have. I feel like the times we're in right now, like a figure like Rabbi Sacks is sorely missing, because I feel like there's no like voice coming from the rabbis that is just like inspiring. I'm not talking about just shiurim. Like all you hear is like the gogu magog shiurim, and then or you hear the you hear the ultra Haredi approach, or you hear rabbis talking about politics, but inspirational kind of messages, and also kind of paving the way for post October 7th Judaism. I don't hear those conversations. I feel like there's a big lack. And actually, I'm noticing that the people are actually the ones, like, for example, today.
And that's what counts.
And I'm listening, I find myself listening to a lot of, people who are, let's say, for example, comedians, Jewish comedians like Ami Kozak. I find myself listening to him more than I do to certain rabbis, or I listen to, some influencer. And the people are speaking up, and like it's interesting because in the world that we're living in today, the people are becoming the brands in a way, and they have a lot of influence, and it's no longer just the rabbi who has a voice. It's very interesting what's happening.
Yeah, but there are some, and some will emerge. I don't know if you listen ever to Meir Soloveitchik,
yes,
who certainly presents a very he's a public intellectual, maybe the leading certainly the leading rabbi public intellectual and one of the leading Jewish public intellectuals. But we have many columnists and other speakers. It's a wider range, obviously.
Yeah, I don't want to say all of them. Obviously, we have our own personal rabbi, Rabbi Maruf, who's phenomenal. He's really he's so understanding of. He's so sensitive to the times that we're in, and also Rabbi Jonathan Halevi is somebody who we really admire.
Yeah, look, you're comparing Rabbi Sacks. This is a once in a maybe in a century type of figure. You've had a lot of chief rabbis in England. No one was like him. He was the the rabbi not just to the Jews in England, to the non-Jews. I mean, he was a moral spokesman, someone who could. We miss his voice right now. Oh, do we miss his voice to
And
speak
I
to the
always
world
say,
about the morality of what's happening and the immorality of the progressive outlook? We really miss his voice on the world stage.
yeah, and I
Okay,
think
what
we're
can
gonna
you do? We're a
appreciate.
bereft generation.
We're gonna appreciate. I think people will appreciate Rabbi Sacks in a century from now. I think he's just he's gonna be he's just so underrated right now. But
Well,
read his
people will
books.
read him. People will read him in a century from now. So that's most rabbis will not be read, but he's one. He had
Exactly.
an enormous impact. And look, I knew him personally, so uh, but yeah, these are great figures.
What was that experience like? I always love to hear a good Rabbi Sacks story.
Well, I'll tell you a good Rabbi Sacks story. I told it in my class as well, though. That so I came to England to speak actually at his at a show right near where he was living. So he asked me to come see him. We had corresponded before that, but that was the first time I met him. And he would talk a lot. He didn't listen so much. He talked, but so he said to me, first he began by saying he reviewed my book on Rabbi Weinberg. I mean, he read all my stuff. He liked it very much. He even read my blog post, the Svarim blog, which really gets into the weeds. He said to me, but now it's time for me to he said to me, I didn't ask him, but he told me, he says, I want you to start writing for the Wall Street Journal. I want you to start writing for the New York Times. I want you to bring your vision to the wider world. In other words, he was telling me that I should be like him. So on the one hand, it's a big compliment. He thinks that I have something to say to the world, that I should start writing, like basically like Mayor Soloveitchik, who's writing for the Wall Street Journal every few months. The truth, but I said to Rabbi Sacks, the truth is that that's not my interest. I'd rather write a blog post about some obscure rabbi from 200 years ago that maybe 1,000 people find interesting than write a piece. My daughter actually has had a few pieces in the Wall Street Journal. So she gets 100,000, readers, not me. But what can you do? That's not my interest. But he stressed the point. He thought that there's a need for Jewish spokesmen in the wider world, for the world at large. And he thought that I had the talent, the ability, whatever. I might have the talent, I might not, but I certainly don't have the desire. So I had to disappoint Rabbi Sacks, and I submitted one article after that, maybe because he inspired me, and the Wall Street Journal turned it down. So I said, enough with that. I'm going back to the things I do best. And but that I thought was interesting because you saw, and I'm sure Rabbi Sacks said the same thing to many. I was significantly younger then, probably 15 years ago. I'm sure he said the same thing to a number of younger people, that it's important for us to carry on, because he believed, like Hirsch did, that Judaism is not just for the Jews, that we have something to say to the world. We're a universal religion. We have universal values and an outlook. And he didn't want to be the only person out there. So that's my Rabbi Jonathan Sacks story that I like to repeat.
The things that he was saying also just a few years ago about the mutating virus of anti-Semitism, it's so relevant today. It's just like it's almost prophetic, the stuff he was saying. He has a great talk.
Yes, he saw before many others the dangers of multiculturalism and the
rise of populism,
the division into the Jew as the oppressor, and that the so-called liberation means liberation from the Jew as well. The twisting of right becomes wrong. He saw that before it became obvious to everyone else.
Amazing. Yeah.
Before we go, and this has been an amazing conversation, we wanted to get, if you could tell us a little bit about your interactions with Hakham Faur. He's also someone who's important to us in the podcast. We have a lot of affinity for Hakham Faur, and you mentioned to us before we came on that you had a certain relationship with him. We just wanted to know if you can say a few words on that.
Sure. My relationship was almost exclusively via email. I wrote a piece, a little booklet on Saul Lieberman, the Orthodox, and at the end of it, I dealt with the controversy with Rabbi Faur in his community, which was very similar to what I read about Lieberman. Namely, he was teaching at the JTS and Jewish Theological Seminary, and some of the more right-wing rabbis thought that puzzled him, that made him pasul to teach in the Syrian community. So that was a bit of a controversy in the Syrian world, and I touched on it. And later, I published more documents on this matter. And throughout that, I was in communication with Rabbi Faur, just discussing these matters. And then he invited me to come visit him. He would spend the summers down at the Jersey Shore, Oakhurst, Elberon, one of those towns. So we spent the entire morning together, and that's where I could say I got it from the horse's mouth, as it were, about his life, his time in Lakewood, his outlook, his experiences. He was such a special, interesting person. I don't share a number of his views. I actually think that some of his judgments of the Ashkenazic sages are a little bit skewed, but he was such a unique individual, and I learned so much from him, his writings, and what can I say? A great loss. So these are giants, these people, and we don't appreciate them sometimes when they're here. And we miss them, though, when we see what we miss when they're not here. And I think I have more stuff. I think I have, yes, I have another document I haven't yet published relating to the Faur controversy. Rabbi Hakham Babadi. He was a businessman, but he was a huge Talmud Chacham, one of the leading rabbinic figures in the Syrian community. He was one of the big backers of Faur. In fact, Faur took him to meet Shaul Lieberman, who was, I guess, Faur's other Rebbe, if you want to call him that. And one thing I confirm with Faur, you might be interested, he was such a close student to Rav Aaron Kotler. He learned in Lakewood, and he writes about it, actually. Rav Aaron even came, and when Rabbi Faur opened a yeshiva, he was a young man. He was in his late 20s. He opened a yeshiva in Flatbush. Rav Aaron Kotler in the late 50s came and spoke there. But when Rav Aaron died, they asked Faur to be one of the people to carry the coffin. They heard that from someone, and I didn't know if it was true. And I asked Faur, and he said, yes, he was one of the people that carried it. So that just shows you how respected he was then in the Litvisha world. However, later on, look, he went to the seminary to make a living, make a parnasa. Like the seminary has always been filled with Orthodox individuals, and there were people for either. I don't want to get into the politics, so whether it was for look, Faur would have shiurim, and the place would be mobbed. Everyone would come hear him. So from his side, this was all about jealousy. Here is Rabbi Faur. He's the most popular teacher, and the other rabbis are not as popular. So that on the other side, the other rabbis, the side of the other rabbis was that despite his brilliance, he was teaching at a non-Orthodox institution, and therefore we can't have that in our community. Even if he's personally observant, we can't have someone like that teaching for us. So it became a bit of a balagan for him, and he suffered on account of this, definitely. And it was unfortunate. And I have letters, private letters, back and forth between him and his opponents, which shows the bad blood, and it's really unfortunate. And what can you do, though?
Yeah, it's very unfortunate, and sometimes you could just look at somebody who's like opposed like that for really a silly reason. You realize that maybe it's a badge of honor, that they kind of excommunicated him because he was a very important person, and his writings are unbelievable, and it's just so, it saddens me that people don't have knowledge about his books. And we, especially at we weren't connected to him directly, but we have indirect connections to him through people in our community, Rabbi Biton and his family, and I really, really hope that, with your help, with your articles and everything that you write, that he will, get his due.
Yep.
Okay, but I do have to say that, and I had too much kavod, so I didn't say it to him. I do think that there are certain problems in things he writes. For example, his whole notion, very interesting, he rejects the whole idea that Averroism, philosophy, led to the conversions in Spain, which I think that's a difficult position. But what I would have said to him, but I had too much kavod, is I think he speaks disrespectfully. He has an article about certain Ashkenazic rabbis. So, for instance, he has an article there called Anti-Maimonidean Demons.
Yes.
We've read it.
And here he's speaking about, he's not even speaking about Ashkenazi, he's speaking about the Ramban. And he speaks
Very
about the
Haredi.
Rush. The Rush is an Ashkenazi. Look, we can't, he's a great man. And sometimes people who are great people, they call it the Ritcha D'Oraita. When they get involved in things, they At the end of the day, though, he's not living in medieval times. You can't speak about the Rosh or Rosh ben Yechiel this way, and you can't speak about Nachmanides this way. So I feel that he went overboard sometimes in his, and I think it's unfortunate because it casts a pall over some of his writings and some people who would benefit and would learn a lot because they might see some of these things, they might not want to look at it. Yeah, and that's, look, everyone. I've written things that I regret. I shouldn't have phrased it a certain way. So it's a big problem though, because if these people should recognize that there's so much there. And look, if everyone you read, every writer, there's going to be things that. Yes, there are things in. Or I would have told him if I was his editor, put it a little differently. But and I do think his view of the Ashkenazim. We're not all I think all the good is not found among the Sephardim. Let's put it that way. But look, I was a great admirer of Faur, 100%. But he wasn't a Rebbe, and he didn't want Hasidim. I told him that certain things I disagreed with him when I met him that time. He didn't want you just to follow him. That's a Rebbe. He wanted you to look at his writings, and if you disagreed with him, dispute him in print, and he would respond back. And but where do you find someone who's an expert in the Talmud, in the Rambam, in all the Shelos and Shuvos of the Sephardi rabbis from Salonika, from Syria, from Iraq, and also can write about Derrida and Levinas and modern philosophy? I mean, the breadth of the breadth is unbelievable. That's all I can say.
Very, very well said.
This has been incredible. I hope that we can have you on again. There's so many things that I'm thinking. As now that we've gotten to know you more, I have a lot of thoughts of things that we could do in the future. We'll see, but we want to really thank you. Great conversation. Thank you for your contribution, coming to our humble podcast. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, I thank you for having me. I didn't realize I sort of started waxing on with my views, but you were sitting there listening, so I will. So if it's of interest not just to you to other people, then I'm happy to do it. But Mafia Niustaiti, we say in the Ashkenazic world, in my humble opinion, that's all that I said. At least the second half of the talk. Okay, thank you for having me, and Hatzlacha.
Thank you.
Amen. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.